Well, big news this morning. Disney's ABC is pulling the plug on Jimmy Kimmel Live. The late night show will be off the air indefinitely due to controversy over Jimmy Kimmel's remarks about conservative activist Charlie Kirk's alleged killer. Now, the announcement came after Federal Communications Commission Chairman Brendan Carr told a podcaster that the FCC could take action against Disney and ABC over Kimmel's comments. Carr suggested the FCC could revoke ABC affiliate licenses if no action was taken. ABC did not immediately respond to a request for further comment, and Kimmel's representatives also have not commented. Now, it has been a week since Charlie Kirk's assassination. The outspoken conservative political activist was murdered during a visit to Utah Valley University. Many say it's a violation of the First Amendment. In this past week alone, you may have seen social media posts about people getting fired for either celebrating Kirk's death or speaking out in favor of his alleged killer. And as we just said moments ago, talk show host Jimmy Kimmel was pulled off the airways last night by ABC. Last night, we spoke with Wayne Unger, an associate professor of law at Quinnipiac University. He teaches his students about the First Amendment and freedom of speech. We wanted to invite him back on this morning to talk more about this shift that has happened in the last 7 days. Wayne, thanks so much for being back. We do appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to y'all.
Now, first off, what are your thoughts on how the country as a whole is handling Kirk's murder?
Right. I think it's illustrative of kind of a situation in which we are challenging that freedom of speech and those values. Now, with Jimmy Kimmel in particular, it doesn't illustrate a concrete First Amendment violation, and I'm more than happy to explain more about that. But nonetheless, over the last week since Charlie Kirk was assassinated, we have seen kind of this, well, we can speak, but when we don't like what you say, you cannot speak and we can retaliate against you. And to me, that is just grossly concerning.
Right. A lot of it has to do with truth versus opinion, fact versus opinion. People have their own opinions, and then there are facts. Now, when it comes to Jimmy Kimmel, he was talking about his opinion, and he's very well known for, going off on different areas, whether it be political or about other celebrities. But, we're getting into an area where it's almost like maybe one government office is bullying another about an opinion. Let's get deeper into this. What are the protections that Jimmy Kimmel might have in this situation right now?
Well, so for Jimmy Kimmel's perspective, he may have a contractual protection with respect to Disney and ABC. And that contractual protection, we would probably look at his contract with the network on kind of what that talent contract looks like, and if perhaps Disney is in breach of that contract. But from a First Amendment perspective, which is really what we're concerned about here, we have to say that Jimmy Kimmel doesn't have a First Amendment cause of action or potential claim against the government because the government hasn't done anything besides the FCC chairman merely threatening to pull the licenses. But to be clear, the FCC chairman has not, and to my knowledge, has no actual intention to pull those licenses. Now, if the FCC chairman actually pulled licenses in response to Jimmy Kimmel's remarks, then we would have a First Amendment issue because then that's actual government action that we could contest in court. But in this case, it was Disney who made the decision. And so Disney is not obligated to follow the First Amendment to protect the free speech of its employees, Jimmy Kimmel in particular. So in this regard, Jimmy Kimmel may have a contract dispute with Disney and ABC, but he doesn't have a First Amendment claim against them.
Let's get more into the history of the First Amendment. It wasn't adopted until the late 1700s. There was no television, no radio. Well, maybe there was radio, but no social media, no private companies like there are today. These massive companies that have so much power these days. So while we have the First Amendment, is everything protected under it? It starts to get very confusing.
Right. So it's important to note that the First Amendment is not an absolute right. So your right to free speech and free expression is not absolutely protected by the First Amendment, despite its language implying that it is. So for really since the adoption of the First Amendment, The courts, and specifically the United States Supreme Court, have always said that it's a qualified right. So government can infringe upon your right to free speech and free expression to a certain extent. And the classic example is what, yelling fire or saying bomb on an airplane,
Right.
where there's public safety considerations there that justify the government infringement. But in order to infringe upon somebody's speech or expression, the government needs to present a compelling government interest. And whatever the government does that is actually infringing upon your right needs to be narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling government interest. Here, I would think that if the FCC chairman actually did something like pulling the licenses in response to Jimmy Kimmel's comments, or other individuals who we've seen over the last week face some type of retaliation, well, that would be something that says, okay, hate speech, false speech, offensive speech, that's still protected by the First Amendment. You may not like it, but the fact is, it is protected by the First Amendment.
So basically, Disney prevented the future of finding out if that was in fact going to happen.
Yes, and I think, but let's play the hypothetical as I would with my students, to where if the FCC chairman actually pulled licenses in response to and take his comments from the podcast as an example, that would be a classic First Amendment violation. And the government, defending the FCC chairman here, would not be able to show any compelling government interest for revoking those licenses. So that would be a classic First Amendment case in which I would expect Disney to win if it got that far. But of course, it's not getting that far.
I'm curious if you think we're going to see more of these type of situations, sort of like proactive to prevent things from happening, such as that happened with Disney and Jimmy Kimmel.
Right. And I think the unfortunate answer is yes. We have seen now multiple situations where the Trump administration in particular has, in a way, put its hand on the scale to enforce its viewpoint. And the Republicans in general, many Republicans, to be fair, not all Republicans, have kind of put their hand on the scale. So case in point, the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, just filed a lawsuit against the New York Times for $16 billion. So this is kind of how many Republicans, Donald Trump included, can put their hand on the scale and say, okay, if we file suit for $16 billion, then that potentially chills your speech. And that is something as Americans we should be concerned about, because while it's not directly a First Amendment violation, one that's kind of classic in the textbooks, so to speak, it nonetheless erodes the American value that is presented in the freedom of speech and the free expression of the First Amendment.
It's really interesting because then the fact that it's a $16 billion lawsuit, it will just potentially silence others just seeing the action that is being taken.
Right. And the court, to be fair, the Supreme Court has recognized for decades that a chilling effect upon one's speech is essentially a sufficient injury under the First Amendment. So the government cannot act in any way that chills one's speech. And in this particular regard, I think the mere threat of retaliation has chilled the speech. And my guess is Disney made a business decision to say, okay, do we even risk it, or do we just comply? And in their eyes, they probably chose just to comply, and they terminated Jimmy Kimmel.
Wow. Well, I mean, this is so interesting, really fascinating. We could go on and on. Unfortunately, we didn't run out of time, but we do want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us the way you did. It's very fascinating.
My pleasure, and thank you, as always, for having me.